Glory be to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dearly beloved ones, today we will be dealing with chapter 10, verses 1 to 15 of St. John's Gospel. And we see Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees continues in the 10th chapter, as we find no break between chapter 9 verse 41 and chapter 10 verse 1. All of this is taking place at the conclusion of the feast of the tabernacles, which I have explained to you earlier. Christ here is contrasting the leadership of the Pharisees with his own. He says they have failed as pastors of God's people. The word pastor itself comes from the Latin word to mean shepherd. Their leadership had been marked by deceit and pride and has lacked compassion. Christ, on the other hand, fulfills all the virtue. So he compares himself to be the good shepherd. There is no better loved picture of Jesus than the good shepherd. The picture of the shepherd is woven into the language and the imagery of the Holy Bible. Judea was much more a pastoral country than an agricultural country, and therefore inevitable that the most familiar figure of the Judean uplands was the shepherd. The life of a shepherd was very hard in Judea. No flock ever grazed without a shepherd, and he was never off duty. There being little grass, the sheep were bound to wander, and since there were no protecting walls, the sheep had constantly to be watched. On either side of the narrow plateau, the ground dipped sharply down to the craggy deserts, and the sheep were always liable to stray away and get lost. The shepherd's task was not only constant but also very dangerous. So he had to guard the flock against the wild animals also, especially against wolves. And there were always thieves and robbers ready to steal the sheep. Constant vigilance, fearless courage, patient love for his flock were the necessary characteristics of the Judean shepherd. In the Old Testament, God is often pictured as the shepherd. For the simple example, we have Psalm 23, verse 1: "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." There are many other references. I don't want to explain that in detail. Also, we have to note that the God's anointed one, who is called the Messiah, is also pictured as the shepherd of the sheep. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11, we read, "He will feed his flock like a shepherd." He means Messiah. He will gather the lambs in his arms and will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those that are with young. Just as in the Old Testament picture, the leaders of the church are the shepherds and the people are the flock. St. Paul urges the leaders of Ephesus to take heed to all the flock over which the Holy Spirit have made them overseers. It is Jesus' last command to Peter that he should feed his lambs and his sheep. We read that in St. John itself in chapter 21, verse 15 following. The very word pastor, as I told you, is the Latin word for shepherd. The Palestinian or the Judean shepherd had different ways of doing things. His equipment was very simple. He had a a bag made of the skin of an animal in which he carried his food. In it, he would have no more than bread, dried fruit, some olives, and cheese. The shepherd used his sling as a weapon of offense and defense. But he made one curious use of it. There were no sheepdogs in Palestine, and when the shepherd wished to call back a sheep which was straying away, he fitted a stone into his sling and landed it just in front of the straying sheep's nose as a warning to turn back. His staff was the weapon with which he defended himself and his flock against the marauding beasts and the robbers. He had his rod, which was like the shepherd's crook. With it, he could catch and pull back any sheep which was moving to stray away. At the end of the day, when the sheep were going into the fold, the shepherd held his rod across the entrance, quite close to the ground, and every sheep had to pass under it. We have that reference in Ezekiel 20, verse 37, and also in Leviticus 27:32. As each sheep passed under his rod, the shepherd quickly examined it to see if it had received any kind of injury throughout the day. The relationship between sheep and shepherd is also quite different in Palestine as against other parts of the world. It thus happens that in Palestine, the sheep are often with the shepherd for years, and often they have names by which the shepherd calls them. In Palestine, the shepherd went in front of the sheep and the sheep followed. The shepherd went first to see that the path was safe, and sometimes the sheep had to be encouraged to follow. It is also true that the sheep know and understand the shepherd's voice, and that they will never answer to the voice of a stranger. A very close observer of Palestine and its lifestyle, Mr. W.M. Thompson, says in his book, The Land and the Book, he says so, the shepherd calls sharply from time to time to remind them of his presence. They know his voice and follow on. But if a stranger call, they stop short, lift up their heads in alarm, and if it is repeated, they turn and flee because they know not the voice of a stranger. I have made the experiment repeatedly. This is what W.M. Thompson observes. This is exactly John's picture of Jesus. The Jews did not understand the meaning of the story of the Good Shepherd. So Jesus plainly and without any concealment applied it to himself. He began by saying, I am the door. In this parable, Jesus spoke about two kinds of sheepfolds. In the villages and the towns themselves, there were communal sheepfolds where all the village flocks were sheltered when they returned home at night. These folds were protected by a strong door of which only the guardian of the door held the key. It was to that kind of a fold that Jesus referred in the first two verses, that is verses 2 and 3 of St. John's Gospel, chapter 10. But when the sheep were out on the hills in the warm season and they did not return at night to the village, they were collected into sheepfolds on the hillside. This is the second type of sheepfold. These hillside sheepfolds, they are just open spaces enclosed by a wall. In them, there was an opening by which the sheep came in and went out. But there was no door of any kind. What happened was that at night, the shepherd himself lay across the opening, and no sheep could get out or in except over his body, so that he might know every passage. In the most literal sense, the shepherd was the door. That is why Jesus refers to himself as the door. Through him and through him alone, men find access to God. St. Paul puts it in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 18. Through him we have access to the Father. To describe something of what that entrance to God means, Jesus uses a well-known Hebrew phrase. He says that through him we can go in and come out. To be able to come and go unmolested was the Jewish way of describing a life that is absolutely secure and safe. That is, when a man can go in and out without fear, it means that his country is at peace, that the forces of law and order are supreme, and that he enjoys perfect security. That is what the phrase meant. The leader of the nation is to be one who can bring them out and lead them in. Once a man discovers through Jesus Christ what God is like, a new sense of safety and of security enters into his life. If life is not to be in the hands of a God like that, the worries and fears of life are all gone. Jesus said that those who came before him were thieves and robbers, but he does not here refer to Moses or any other genuine prophets, but to some people who claimed themselves to be the Messiah both before and after Christ. We have some examples in the book of Acts, chapter 5, verses 36 and 37. We have some names like Judas of Galilee and Theudas. These people claimed themselves to be Messiah. It is to those kind of people that Jesus refers to as thieves and robbers. Now, moving to verse 11 to 15, this passage draws the contrast between the good and the bad, the faithful and the unfaithful shepherd. The shepherd was absolutely responsible for the sheep. If anything happened to a sheep, he had to produce some kind of proof that it was not his fault. We read in Amos chapter 3, verse 12, that a shepherd actually rescuing 2 legs or a piece of an ear out of a lion's mouth. Because the law laid it down in Exodus 22:13, if it is torn by beasts, let him bring it as evidence. So the shepherd is responsible to bring in evidence. The idea is that shepherd must bring home proof that the sheep had died and that he had been unable to prevent the death. Isaiah speaks of the crowds of shepherds being called out to deal with the lion in chapter 31, verse 4. To the shepherd, it was the most natural thing to risk his life in defense of his flock. Sometimes the shepherd had to do more than to risk his life itself. But on the other hand, there was the unfaithful shepherd, the false shepherd. They came into the job not as a calling, not as a vocation, but as a means of making money. He was in it simply and solely for the pay that he could get. He might even be a man who had taken into the hills because the town was too hot to hold him. He had no sense of the height and the responsibility of his task. He was only a hireling. Zechariah in chapter 11:16 marks it as the characteristic of a false shepherd that he made no attempt to gather together the scattered sheep. Jesus' point is that the man who works only for reward thinks chiefly for the money. The man who works for love thinks chiefly of the people he is trying to serve. Jesus was the good shepherd who so loved his sheep that for their safety he would risk and one day he would give his life. We may note two further points in this passage. Jesus describes himself as the good shepherd. Now, in Greek, there are two words for good. One word is agathos, Agathos. Agathos simply describes the moral quality of a thing. There is another word for good that is kalos, Kalos in Greek, which means that in the goodness there is a quality of winsomeness which makes it lovely. When Jesus is described as the good shepherd, the word used is kalos, which means in him there is more than efficiency and more than fidelity, there is loveliness. That is Jesus' difference as a good shepherd. The second point is that in the parable, the flock is the church of Christ and it suffers from a double danger. The church is always liable to attack from outside, that is, from the wolves and the robbers outside. And also, it is always liable to trouble from the inside, from the false shepherd. Thus, the church runs a double danger. It is always under attack from outside and often suffers from the tragedy of bad leadership, from the disaster of shepherds who see their calling as a career and not as a means of service. The second danger is by far the worst, because if the shepherd is faithful and good, there is strong defense from the attack from outside. But if the shepherd is faithless and is a hireling, the enemies from outside can penetrate into and destroy the flock. The church's first essential is a leadership based on the example of Jesus Christ. We shall continue with the rest of the session in the next. God bless you all.